And so in Jesus' day, it was not written down. See, now this is, yeah, well, yeah, in fact, it's still not finished really to this day. Rabbis are still making oral Torah today, but they are no longer writing it down. I mean, in one of these big books. The Talmud is completed, it's a closed thing, but we still use the Talmud constantly to determine what should be and what shouldn't be. We use it all the time, as well as the Midrashim, as well as and to increase our own understanding, as well as the Kabbalah. We use them all the time. So we are still using the oral Torah, and in a sense there is still oral Torah being made, but it is no longer being written down. We have a period of time in which the oral Torah of that time is written down. Okay, it begins to be written down around the year 200. The first part of the oral Torah is a section called the Mishnah, and a great rabbi named Rabbi Judah the Prince. Basically, this is the reason he does it, because the Byzantines, and the Byzantines are when the Roman Empire split into the eastern and the western half, the Byzantines are the eastern half of the Roman Empire. They had the Holy Land, and they kind of were on a campaign because the Jews were kind of a thorn in their throat, a bone in their throat. They caused them lots of problems, and the Byzantines were actually wiping out entire Jewish communities. Well, when they wiped them out, they wiped out the rabbi also, or maybe 20 rabbis in a big Jewish community who all had their students and who were all teaching the oral Torah. And Rabbi Judah the Prince said, my God, he said, look at the oral Torah that's lost now, that's lost to us, because no one rabbi had it all, because it's so huge. Because see, they were having to memorize it. So what he did was he said, I need to take what we have and begin to write it down. Otherwise, and the reason this is so interesting is because one of the ideas behind the oral Torah, the Torah Shebe'al Peh in Hebrew is what it's called, the Torah from the mouth, is that it can't be written down. It shouldn't be written down. It was forbidden to write it down. But he makes a new ruling, and the reason he does is because he saw so many Jewish communities being wiped out. And actually, thank God that he did, because if he hadn't have, who knows what would have happened. Well, no, we can know what would have happened because we still have the promises of God. You see, the Jewish people should be gone many, many times in history. The recent one just in the last century. They should be gone. They should not have survived. They really and truly should be off the face of the earth. And the reason that they're still on the face of the earth, it's so obvious to me, is because God promised them. God made them promises, and he preserves them in spite of everything. Now, the other thing interesting about the oral tradition, you'll hear it called several things by different teachers and different rabbis. The oral Torah, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral traditions, or just the traditions, or you hear them say the sages say, or the rabbis say. All of those things are references to the oral Torah. Now, to a Jew, I don't expect this for Christians, but to a Jew, but Christians should know that to a Jew, the oral Torah is carries the same weight as the written word. It's exactly the same weight. That's hard for Christians to sometimes understand, but the more I think you become acquainted with Judaism and the way the rabbis thought and the way the Jewish people thought and believed and what they taught, I think you can begin to see why that is. What that tells us, now I know we're in a side here, we're not on the riddle anymore, we're going to come back to the riddle. What that tells us is something that to me is so extremely interesting. The Jews of Jesus' day, see, sometimes they are presented that they didn't know how to read. Yeah, that they were very, very ignorant. They didn't know how to read. They didn't know how to write. That's like the scholars 100 years ago. This is interesting. Scholars 100 years ago, said that Abraham, in his day, writing hadn't even been invented yet. It's very interesting. They were making this big deal of it, and if you can find it, probably you can find it now on the internet or in some books. The statements of those great scholars, and these were great Christian scholars who were saying writing hadn't even been invented in the days of Abraham. Suddenly an archaeologist pulls tablets out of a place in Iraq now that that dated to like 4,000 years ago with writing on them, or 4,000, I'm sorry, 2,000 years before Abraham with writing on them, to show suddenly it's like God says, you know, look, listen to these idiots, these smart aleck people. So let me show them that writing was very, very much in existence. Yes.
Do you teach that a lot of the Bible was written at the second captivity?
No, not necessarily. It was in the second captivity. Now, the second captivity is after the Roman destruction. The first captivity is the Babylonian captivity. So the second captivity to us is the Roman captivity after 70. Much of it was probably, I think it was already written, but there was, but when the Jews returned under Ezra from Babylon, one of the things Ezra did was reestablish the Sanhedrin, and one of the things that he did, it wasn't the Sanhedrin then, it was called the Men of the Great Assembly, because it was more than 70. There was like 3 or 4 times that number. And one of the things that they did was to establish what would be allowed into the canon, in other words, what would be authorized as scripture and what wouldn't be. And so that's for sure we know, because we have records of that in Jewish history.
And Deuteronomy was found when they rebuilt the temple, right?
Yes. Yeah, the book of Deuteronomy, yes, you're right. You're exactly right. By one of the kings, yeah. Yeah, which changed everything. Yeah. Which that just shows us how far they had gotten away during that period of time. But that God, once again, made a discovery, had to make a discovery to bring them back. Now, what I was going to say, in the days of Jesus, not only were the people literate, and not only were they so intelligent, they had all of Scripture memorized. Because you see, we didn't have the convenience of things like this, or the convenience of things like little Franklin electronic Bibles that everybody could carry around in their pocket and look up a word. They actually had it memorized, as well as the majority of the oral Torah. They wouldn't have had it memorized because they had a sage or they had a rabbi who was close at hand. But the rabbi had it memorized, had it all memorized. So many times in Jesus' teaching, in Yeshua's teaching, he makes what we call word hooks. He mentions 1 or 2 words, and we can find them, that actually open up an entire passage back in the Old Testament, back in the Tanakh. And the people would have caught exactly what he is saying. It's an amazing thing, the way the rabbis taught, especially the sages of Israel taught in the first century. An absolutely amazing thing. These people, I've been told so many times by such great teachers of Israel, that the farther we go back in history, we have this idea, you know, it's a secular idea. It's that people are more primitive. But actually, the farther we go back in history, people are not more primitive, especially when we come to spirituality and their spiritual capacity. They're much, much more advanced than we are today. Now, to show that to you, it goes along with physical things as well as, see, we have no idea the damage that was caused to us by the Dark Ages and what was lost in that period of time. Just to give you one example, there are stones that if you ever go to Israel with me, I can show you, that are so huge in the western wall. This is just the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. There are stones that are so huge that we do not have modern equipment that can move them. How did they get them there? We don't have a crane, not even 10 cranes, powerful enough to move these stones. How did the Jews of first century Israel under Herod the Great move these stones?